All right, everyone, it is 1:30 on the dot, so we can go ahead and get started. As Marissa mentioned, there's going around. So I think, though, we can go ahead, and if everyone should know why they're here, but if they don't, this is the Data and Systems Integration Committee, and so we'll go ahead and get started. We can start with welcome and introduction. So I will introduce myself, and then we can just kind of go around our table and introduce yourself. My name is Joy Andrade, and I am on the HPI board and the committee of this, or chair of this committee.
I'm Liz Sheehan, and I'm also on the HPI board.
I'm Mark Brewer, Hope Center.
Jeff Jones, Hope Center Outreach.
Dustin Alford, Hope Center Outreach.
Erica Dominguez, Lexington Rescue Mission.
Christina Ellison, Women's Leader.
Dave Chat, Hope Center.
Marty Jones, Community Action Council.
Hunter Welch, Community Action Council.
I'm Shalisa with Independence Place.
I'm Eric Evans, also Independence Place.
Jackie Long, Mount Comprehensive Care Center.
Kim Collins, Kirsten. Billy Bud, and Brother Government.
Alicia Veras, volunteers on American State.
Dave Chat, Gibson.
Nancy Lawrence with
Anthony, Green 17. Marissa Webb, Continuing Care Coordinator.
And Jeff Herron, Manager, LFECG, Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention.
Wonderful. All right, so the next item is to approve the minutes from April 3rd, so some time ago. And I don't know if anyone has had the chance to take a look at those, but if there are any questions or edits that need to be made before those are approved, please feel free to add comments.
And it's possible that you looked at them back when we were to meet in June.
Yes.
I'll make a motion to approve.
All right, wonderful. And we have a second.
Come from anybody in the membership.
So,
Wonderful.
I've got until one for a second. I'm sure there was others, but
Okay, and then so we have to do a large vote, right? So all those in favor? All right, so new business on the agenda is we are gonna have Jeff cover the housing triage system policies and procedures.
all right. So I will start us off. Marissa may also chime in throughout this process, but we're gonna just do a little bit of an introduction to the final format that you see before you. First, just a general note as to our plan for finalizing and implementing the assessment. What we're hoping to do today is put this to a membership vote before we would take it to the board for formal adoption. So this is really where ideally additional tweaks would occur. If possible, it would be great for us to have an approved version, even if we have to make a motion with some kind of a qualifier so that we can move forward. But I also don't want us to take that step until we're, as a community, fully prepared. What we would do after this is once we all agree on our base assessment, between now and the board meeting, we would engage our partners that serve youth and families to help us to finalize youth and family tools. We can either call a special meeting of the membership or this committee and get approvals from the membership on those documents once drafted and bring everything ideally to the September board meeting. Marissa and I have discussed that we could potentially implement as early as October 1, but definitely what we would want to do between now and board approval is have some persons that have experience in administering our current tool that can help us to administer the new assessment with some clients, ideally those that have previously completed a VI SCDAT. We don't want you to have to do 2 assessments with them simultaneously. But we do think there's value in us testing in real life this tool before we would do a widespread rollout. Concerns that we would have would be if we identify changes. We don't want to make frequent changes, and we also want to make sure that we give enough time that we're able to see what the effectiveness of the tool is. So again, just really wanting to avoid a process where we're continually tweaking, because then it's hard for us to even gauge what this tool is doing for us. So we could potentially implement wide-scale system as early as October 1, or if we encounter during testing some tweaks and problems that we need to address, we could potentially delay to the beginning of the calendar year and roll out January 1. But we just want to make sure that everything is comfortable and the most effective that it can be. We want to address truly the concerns that we had about our previous tool and make sure that that is covered. So, some things that you will see here, we have given in your packet the revised policies and procedures, which will be updated to reflect this. That's going to include removing mentions of the VI SCDAT. It's going to include a expansion of our prioritization policies to touch on dynamic prioritization, and also adjusting the ranges that we use for referral to particular types of resources within our system. You also will have what looks like a sample HMIS intake form. Since we don't have everything in HMIS yet, this is the easiest way for us to visually present the new assessment tool to you. This would be something that somebody could print off and potentially use on paper if they did not administer directly into the laptop or system. And then I will draw your attention to the policies and procedures, page 19. And that's going to be the biggest shift that you're going to see from previous conversations. We have listened to some of the concerns about things like our current assessment tool not being an accurate gauge of acuity, or some frustrations that people have about long wait times for things like persons that would be a low-level PSH referral generally. So what we have incorporated here is the practice of dynamic prioritization, which many communities are actively doing and HUD recommends. It's really leaving a little bit of flexibility within our policies to consider certain factors and what would serve the persons that are most vulnerable in the quickest amount of time without lengthy waits for a resource that they may have to wait an exponentially long time for, or potentially never receive due to the level of community need. So some things that would involve would be things like having some local tiebreaker factors, where if we have folks in a household that are essentially going to be of equal priority, that we can consider a local tiebreaker factor that would guide us towards who we feel like is truly most vulnerable and needs to be referred first if all other things are equal. So this would be things like if someone has an extremely high utilization of emergency services like emergency rooms, jails, and psychiatric facilities, the extent to which persons, especially children and youth, would remain unsheltered, risk of continued homelessness. So this would be things like that low acuity PSH that would be likely to wait years on our list for a PSH level resource. This would give us the flexibility if we thought it wasn't a good fit for their needs, potentially serve them with rapid rehousing, but also doesn't box us into only serving PSH acuity for folks in rapid rehousing. We would still serve some of the people that we are generally currently prioritizing for rapid rehousing. And then vulnerability to death or illness, and vulnerability to victimization like physical assault, sexual assault, trafficking, or sex work. Then on the prioritization scale, we have removed days on the list to replace with that local tiebreaker as the criteria that we would go to if acuity was to be the same, and actually there should be straight through on the vulnerability factors. We're replacing those with the local tiebreaker. So acuity, length of time homeless, and then if it's an equal tie, we would move to those local tiebreaker factors. We're going to be doing away with our existing vulnerability factors and prioritizing, because we don't want that to be something that would be a fair housing concern where points were awarded just simply on the basis of someone's identity, and it's shifted more to things like vulnerability to victimization, which is more objective and not just based on someone's identity. It's about risk and vulnerability. And we also felt that the amount of days on the list is really an arbitrary kind of factor. It could just be that someone has a better case manager who got them onto the list more quickly. So that's why we felt the local tiebreaker factors were a better consideration when there is an equal match for prioritization. Then, and it's also did not anticipate as many people as we have today, but I did bring a limited number of copies of the printout that would display the assessment tool so you can follow along with the conversation. I do ask that if there's not enough and someone's interested, you share with a neighbor. Marissa and I did make a couple of tweaks to some of the point values. We just had some things that when we looked at it again with fresh eyes, seemed to have a really high weight and potential duplication of points for the same factor. Like, for example, that substance use maybe had points that were awarded in multiple areas. So we didn't want one disability type or one issue to essentially be ranked higher than another. We want to try to make things as equal as possible. So we did make some minor tweaks to points. All those values are going to be listed where they apply. And again, we can use the range that is in the policy and procedure manual. That is, I don't think listed in the prioritization section. It is in the definitions, and we can pull that out for you. I apologize, it's not more clearly visible. But we did a similar approach to how the VI SPDAT is scored, where roughly the top half of the score range would be PSH, and then the second half would be kind of a break between diversion case management and rapid rehousing. Okay, so they are on page 20. Yes, they are on here. So PSH for individuals would shift to 12 plus. I believe the top score that we had was 24. And then 5 to 11 would become our rapid rehousing range if approved, and our case management or diversion range would just bump up to 0 to 4 from the current 0 to 3. This is a lot to unpack. I think the place for us to start is with the assessment tool, and then once we have that discussion, we can look at the policies to see if there's anything policy related that we would want to make alterations to. I don't know how much time that you had to look over this from the meeting packet sent out last week, so we'll give just a minute or two for anybody that might need to be looking at a hard copy. And then we'd like to just do a quick pass through, and Marissa and I can point out some things that might have been modified, and we can use that as a discussion point. So we can definitely take more time and pause in any sections that we need to. Just want to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to at least glance through. So pages 1 and 2 and continued on to the start of page 3. These are going to be universal data elements without points that are assigned. This is largely going to be things like our demographics and prior living situation, just kind of the basic information that we need on individuals in general. Then about halfway down page 3, we begin with our questions that kind of help us to do some diversion work. Once we approve a tool, Marissa and I are going to set up some mandatory trainings for all assessors. We want to make sure that we're all doing things in a consistent way. But we really want to emphasize the role of diversion within our system. We want to make sure that we're having those conversations that are transparent about things like limitations on what shelter options that we might have, setting realistic expectations about how quickly people might get referred through our housing triage system, so that there are better, less intensive, less traumatic interventions for people, that we can steer them in that direction through honest conversation. That's going to be something that for some of you, it's going to be hard. It's going to be trying to set realistic expectations, but sometimes it's going to be telling people information they don't want to hear and you don't want to say. We will definitely coach you on diversion strategies and how we have those conversations. So don't be hesitant about that. On the first diversion item, there was originally only point values that were assigned to essentially locations that would be unsheltered or places not meant for human habitation. We wanted to make sure that we still assign some weight to other situations that would meet our literal homeless definition. So we added 1 point for emergency shelter and for transitional housing, but then doubled the points for those places not meant for human habitation, still giving them a higher priority. Do we feel like there's anything there we need to discuss since that is a change?
I really like that. The only thing, is it possible to put like something that either comes up when they click or that is like visible from the start, that if a situation isn't homelessness, that you should make it after the diversion part?
Yeah, we can put like even, we have the ability without contacting our vendor, if someone is in HMIS, we can put a subheading section there that would say, if this individual is not currently in a homeless situation, we would have them stop after the diversion section. We go ahead and have them go through the next several questions, so we put another big reminder at the end of the section. Reminder, if this individual is not residing in X, Y, or Z situation, this is where you stop. We can definitely facilitate that. Awesome. But we still think it's important to go through the rest of the diversion questions so you can have that informed conversation about how to divert. If we have no discussion on that, then we'll continue to go through. We're also just collecting other information like approximate date homelessness started, if there's other factors that might cause them to leave where they're currently staying. Maybe they're not currently in a literal homeless situation, but maybe there's something like PD, maybe they're staying somewhere that there is substandard living conditions. That would just kind of help you continue that conversation. We're gonna ask them about other things that they've tried to access housing. We're gonna get a sense of things like their employment history, barriers to shelter, and just generally what they feel like may be contributing to their situation. And if the assessor feels like they are getting truthful information that is an accurate descriptor of an individual's situation. Any questions or thoughts on the diversion section before we move into our base assessment?
I do. With going back a couple of things like the hotel, motel, do they still get a point if that is a paid for by, like essentially it's the active shelter?
And we can put some clarifiers in here, but that would be emergency shelter is how HUD would define it. We can make sure that there's some parentheticals or a definition that's included here. But it would be important to have the distinction between if an agency is paying or the individual, because if HUD would consider an agency paying, emergency shelter, individual pain, marginally housed. That's a great point. Other things for the diversion section? Okay, then moving on to the base assessment, starting on page 5. We did include something that is a more broad question about if someone feels like their membership within a minority status has been directly tied to discrimination in services. This moves us away from previous vulnerability factors, which more explicitly assign vulnerability to just being of a marginalized group. This is making sure that just so much like if we were assessing a disability, not just that someone meets a specific criteria, but that there is an impact, there is a kind of functional impairment that they have experienced due to that status. We again are collecting information about the language that someone prefers or feels best able to express themselves. We are considering if there is a significant language barrier that has prevented them from accessing services. We are definitely still assessing for things like if there might be human trafficking or sex trafficking, any kind of manipulation into risky behaviors, kind of what the PIs for that phrased is there anyone who forces you or tricks you into doing anything that you do not want to do? We are still actively assessing for those that are fleeing DV. As a reminder, those who are actively fleeing DV or trafficking meet category 4 of HUD's homeless definition and do not necessarily have to be residing in an emergency shelter or in a place not meant for human habitation at the time of assessment or referral, but it is a requirement that they are taking active steps to flee that situation. We are assessing if somebody has a diagnosed mental health condition. A couple of notes here. We did kind of reduce some of the points here. It seemed like there was potential on this item and a later item about substance use for someone to rack up a lot of points if they answered that they had a co-occurring disorder. So this makes co-occurring and a mental health disorder the same value. It's essentially trying to make sure that we are scoring the mental health component and not the substance use component on this particular item. The other thing that we would intend to do here is we are going to do a follow-up field if people answer yes for a mental health condition, that we can have you put some information into something like a drop-down that would include criteria that would be eligible for New Beginnings program under our policies. That helps us much more easily identify participants for them. We still have to verify those conditions because this is still self-report, but it helps really shrink down the pool of persons that we're looking for. Many of you know from our meetings that that's something that can sometimes be a lengthy conversation. This just helps us do some of the work in advance. We also are still assigning a point if we feel like there is an underestimation of the individual's mental health needs, like if they have no awareness of their mental health condition. There was at one point back in January, during that conversation, we had a version of this where there was also points that were assigned to if someone overestimated their needs. As we reconvened on this in July, we could not recall exactly what that conversation was 6-7 months ago, but it seemed counterintuitive that we would assign points for acuity if somebody was overestimating their mental health care needs, because essentially we would be like rewarding or adding acuity to a condition that doesn't exist at the level that the individual reports, and that seems like it works against us rather than for us. But I wanted to raise the point in case somebody remembered something that led us to that decision and revisit it if needed. But it just didn't, for me, I was not able to wrap my head around why we would add points for that.
I think every conversation we had was if they it was so typical that they underestimated.
Likewise.
Yeah, I think that was just a mistake.
So I think it's much easier to deal with somebody overestimating their needs because the core need isn't there. It's just helping them see it or address it.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to go back to the DV, I guess, question. Is there a way that we can capture that in the diversion part? Is there- If there are, it seems, I mean, there is a question about whether they're, whether it's safe or they're staying or whatever, but in terms of if we're gonna stop them at diversion if they don't, fit into one of those categories of homelessness, it doesn't seem that's clear on exactly where that might fall in diversion to make sure they continue if it is someone who's fleeing domestic violence.
So it looks like we most clearly addressed that in the diversion section on item 3. We can work to install some language that just would make it clear if they are actively fleeing. There could be a follow-up question. If they answer yes, then we can continue with the assessment. Thank you. If we're good with the mental health, then as you can see, we do try to get some additional information. And then we have our item that was more around substance use. And this we may need to take a look at because this is 2 points too on this. And we have 1 point assigned for the mental health. Is that?
I was wondering if I would help remember it's talking about.
So that'd be a 2 points. So you see what I'm saying?
Is that maybe to compensate for the lack of co-curricular points? But that wouldn't make sense.
I don't think so.
I
that
think
one
this
was
should be a 1 point. So if we approve this, it's gonna be with the revision to make this 1 point. And similar, the second point that would be possible for substance use would be through an underestimation of the substance use descriptor.
So a total of 2 points for, potentially 2 points for yes and an underestimation of needs. I think that's what we discussed.
So that's just a failure for us to change that item. And if it impacts scoring ranges at the end, it'd be a factor of that extra point, and we will, I think it does, we'll adjust that down.
I think that there is some risk there that being confusing to people with the underestimation. If they put yes, they may think that they can't then put underestimate. Does that make sense?
Can you say it again?
So like if you were assessing someone, they said, oh yeah, sometimes I do that because I have trouble sleeping. But you know that they're somebody without you would put underestimate needs,
Right.
but only if you realize that you could, right? So like just from reading, I know there's training, but people do forget all the time.
Right.
So if there's something.
We could also, in addition to incorporating it into training, we could explicitly add some language to our policy manual, which talks about the assessor points. Because we'll also, with that mandatory training, we'll have some requirements of people going through some training and completing some items for us. So that's definitely something that we could do before this goes to the board.
I have a question about the mental health condition.
Yeah.
So co-occurring is, do you have one or more of these in the NPS checkbox? Like all of these here. So that would meet the yes for mental health condition, but co-occurring here is only one of these and substance use, like multiple, like if you said you had bipolar disorder and anxiety disorder, that would not be co-occurring.
Correct. Yeah, we're looking at the combination of both mental health and substance
So the
use.
co-occurring is just those two specifically.
And I appreciate everyone's questions. Please continue. Don't stop that. That's exactly what we saw from today's meeting. We also wanted to assess if individuals had any difficulties or barriers to accessing medication or other medical needs such as medical equipment, either for physical or mental health. I think originally we had this more tied to the mental health, and we wanted to make sure that it also applied to those that might have physical health conditions as well. Item 20, are you currently pregnant or is there anyone in your household currently pregnant? We had kind of had a sub-question on this that was around dependents. We removed that because that's gonna live on the family assessment when we get there. And this right now would just be our individual or adult assessment. So we're only gonna consider points for if there's a member of the household that's currently pregnant. If this is the household that has minor children already, we would be doing the family assessment, and that would be factored in prioritization there. We also are retaining question around how long someone's lacked a permanent nighttime residence. We modified that language from how long has someone been homeless, because all of our service providers know that that term can carry a lot of connotations, and we're trying to get closer to our definition of lacking a fixed nighttime residence. Point values should look like what we've discussed previously, with the highest point values going to those that would meet a more chronic homeless type definition. In item,
I was just saying, did you need to ask the approximate date that homelessness started? Or you got it on question 2?
It's on twice. That was one that we had talked about putting on there twice, because if somebody either skipped the diversion questions, or they saw those diversion questions were already answered, or they were just wanting to, we didn't want to put the question when it comes to start in just the assessment, because we want to gather that information for diversion as well. So ideally, that information should be the same, but that way it can be used for 2 different places.
and it would run on the same field, so we can pull it from reporting. Wherever they've plugged that in, the same value is going to pull over. So it's not possible that our report would generate 2 different responses. It's going to pull the same one, regardless of where it was entered. For item 23, there were a few things that we did modify here. We were trying to make sure that this didn't, again, really put a lot of points on certain conditions like substance use or mental health. So if someone's already previously gotten points towards acuity from answering and weigh on those items, we didn't award additional points here. What we're trying to capture is things that wouldn't otherwise be captured in other specific items on our school, like if someone's homelessness were caused by something like an addiction. We also reduced some of the points because for some reason, for example, a condemnation of a unit was carrying a higher point value than anything else in this item. And to me, that did not seem like it was necessarily intuitive. Just because someone's unit was condemned doesn't necessarily tie to their individual acuity. It's more about the housing that they were in. So we would definitely consider that if it was abrupt, could have an impact on someone's current need because of it being something they did not anticipate for, may not have the resources to deal with, but we didn't think it should be prioritized higher than other risk factors. Discussion around item 23.
Instead of job loss, could it just be like income loss?
Yeah. Loss of income. I think that's much more appropriate.
The dropped off in Lexington, can we get like a text box there so we can say who
I
did
will
it?
gladly collect that information.
Like I feel like I would enter that for everybody at the table quickly.
Right.
Literally got a call on the way over here about one of those situations, as did Marty. And I believe that it's the same household that was dropped off to you about a week or 2 ago. So, yes, we will gladly collect that to see if there's anything that we can follow up on. I can say that our chief of police and mayor did address that particular situation the first time around.
Because he could put a drop off also for the county that came from. And we follow the track of counties that are dropping off.
We'll collect as much information as we can. Anybody have any
Can you
changes?
one of those pictures, you know, like when your car goes through a toll bridge and it snaps a picture? Drop off
I get
at the
these
Hope Center.
anecdotes all the
There's the
time.
picture.
People allegedly tell me about vans that just drop people off, and I'm like, I really wish that I had some kind of evidence that that was true so I could try to address it.
I know they do, because when I did that those trainings last year for the police chiefs.
Yeah.
When I'm listening at breaks, they were literally talking about how they would just look at what taken to the county or taken from.
We've even had a couple of videos before, but it was like one of those things where if you couldn't like get a clear license plate number or something, there's nothing you can do with it. Any changes that we feel like we need to discuss or make on item 23?
No changes, but I do have a question stemming off of the, kind of the joke about what county's dropping people off. Do we have anywhere on here, or do we have any desire to record people's quote-unquote home counties, like where they may have originated from?
It may not have needed in here, but there is a field in HIS that we can gladly add county of homeless origin, something like that.
It's just a little easier if we know where they came from or what services they may have had access to and what may have brought them here.
Yeah, we definitely would like to know where that origin
I have noticed that there are some people in Balance State HMIS that got services in Franklin County and are here and they're still in the system, so.
So for 23, I do have a question.
Yeah.
So like, I know, again, it may be too in the weeds, but whenever we're doing like the training for actually administering this, the discussion around like why they became homeless, for example, like the part with drug use being listed there versus behavior or addiction. I understand sometimes, right, those could be taken. So a person staying with somebody and they find they have something out. But I would say in the training, if it's not already highlighted, I would definitely really highlight that, to really run through that, because if substance use caused them to behave in a way that caused them to become evicted, or if they became evicted due to non-payment, then they could get a point. But if they just said,
there should be some follow-up discussion if someone answers eviction around what was the cause for the eviction. For example, we would have a sense of what the true primary cause there would be. I agree there could be potential for it.
Yeah, because I would just worry about somebody being like, oh yeah, that's because I was using. Cool, but were you evicted as a result, or just asked to leave? Yeah. Yeah, but then if the form they kicked you out, saying you take points, so like it's.
I think that's a good point. Something that we had talked about both in the meetings that where we were discussing this assessment as a whole, and also when me and Jeff were looking at it again, was something that people had brought up was that even though it is client-centered and that's client self-reported, it's not very conversational in the way that the VSBDA is currently structured. And ideally, we want this to serve as a conversation, so that way it can't be like, okay, what was the reason for that eviction to actually get
Because also, if we kind of for our policies keep the burden of service or ongoing contact with the initial assessor, having that conversation gives you more tools to serve that person, whether they get a housing triage resource or a house another way. You have more information and we can make it more conversational.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
In the interest of time, we'll keep going, but we can revisit it if people want to add other things on 23. 24, we did make a slight change to reduce the number of hospital visits that we were including in the ranges here. I had been in Kentucky Interagency Council on Homelessness meeting, and we had talked about for some data that they've done with hospitals, they were using 8+ visits as their measure of high utilizers. And I think we were ultimately scaling this up to something like 12+. And it just seemed like after a while, it gets arbitrary whether someone's visits are 8 or 12. Either way, it's a pretty excessive use of emergency services. There's clearly either a true condition that is really poorly managed and causing them to go to the hospital frequently, which indicates high vulnerability, or there's some other factor like mental health that's playing into that, where they're going there unnecessarily. But we still feel like it's captured even if we don't go all the way up to 12+.
And that's useful actually too, because we can look at assisted compare, we can get those numbers pulled for us from the state.
Yeah.
And we can lay it side by side and see how we're doing compared to.
And there was a, kind of our attempt to better align our data with what other systems might be tracking. We did a similar, well, we'll get there in a second. There's a question in between about if somebody might have something that would be a life-threatening or debilitating condition. These are very severe chronic conditions that would either make it that someone's extremely vulnerable in a homeless situation or potentially increase their vulnerability to death. It's going to be one of the highest amount of points that we have on any one item. I think we have set it at 3. I think we had previously been 4. But because we have reduced points in some other areas, we didn't want one item to carry a point value that was essentially double what you would get from other items. We wanted to bring it further in line. It would be rated similar to as somebody was experiencing 3+ years of homelessness. For incarceration, similar to what we did with hospitals, we just bumped that down to 8 or more times and adjusted those scales. Because essentially, if you are arrested 8 times in a year or 12 times in a year, it's kind of an arbitrary difference. It still means you have a lot of legal stuff going on. We then have a couple more questions that aren't directly factored into prioritization that do help us understand some challenges and needs that people have. I'm going to try to speak above the rain. I apologize for
Well,
that.
everybody's windows are up and tops are up.
And then we will, again, have to adjust to make sure we subtract that extra point. We'll make the policy revisions that are required to match that. But this is where the bulk of our point values would stop, and then we move into just some questions that, again, if you're going to be facilitating an ongoing service or contact with this individual, help you to best figure out how to serve them.
And I think also, because we do understand who the assessor may be, may not be the individual who is providing ongoing services. And so at the time of assessment, we wanted to at least provide some case management questions for whomever will be taking that on, to have some of that initial information and how relevant that recent is.
So to make sure that we are kind of keeping an eye on the time, the rest of the questions are going to be things like fields that people would have seen in HMAS that are sub-assessments, which just collect current living situation information or information about how an assessment is administered. But that gets us through a review of the tool. Now that we've covered everything, is there any area that we want to revisit before we would potentially vote? And it can be an area that we touched on that we need a change at this final draft, or it can be an area that maybe you've had a question or consideration on in previous discussions.
So what do those get? So do they both get tracking and reported, or you said a single thing is provided?
Essentially, if we use the same field, like on the back end, it would be the same identifier that we would drop into a report. It will pull the most recent value. So it would probably pull the one that was down in the base assessment later in the assessment, because it's just generally how our system functions. Usually it's going to bump anything that's the most current answer to what we pull in our report. Other discussion on the tool, especially if there's any of our direct service providers who currently do assessments, if there's any area that you think we need to revisit. I know this has been a long process, but we want to get it right.
I think this is much better than what we've been using.
Well, that's a step in the right direction. I would hope so after the time we've invested and all the work that everyone in this room has put into this. So I'm glad to hear that. All right, as there's no additional comments on the assessment tool, what about in terms of policies? We again will correct the ranges.
And, sorry, I was just gonna say, at current, when we look at the prioritization ranges, it will state family, and it will reference it, yes, but up there, as well as down in the definitions. And that is simply because at this meeting, at this time, the local Lexington Housing Triage Assessment is not yet fully flushed with youth and families, but by the time it goes to the board, it would be. So those edits and changes will be made and will be reflected in the policies and procedures as well.
So that section will be less text heavy. There will be all those qualifiers and brackets and parentheses.
Right.
But we wanted to again focus on this tool. So we didn't have time to pull all that together. Didn't want to do it without your input, especially providers that directly serve youth and families.
For the policy, I really liked the shortened intro and outro script dialogue versus some of the other versions of it, and I liked the definition process. So, for prior submissions. I don't even know if that was a change this time, but I just liked it.
I think we actually plan to reduce the scripts further.
That'd be great.
We just didn't have time. Right now we're down a staff member, and with everything that's going on, we were just trying to get something to the group. But we are going to refine that even further. We want it to be something that's more like a paragraph than a page. Because if you're not doing this with the tool in front of you, if you're doing HMIS, unless we type out the entire script for you to read off, then it sounds like you're just reading a page to someone. It's going to take the focus off that conversational tone. If we give you a paragraph, at the very least, if you're not verbatim, you can memorize the key points and just rattle them off.
Makes sense. I really like that. You know, shortened it and
Are we ready for a vote, or do we want to pause?
Not really related, this may probably only applies to me, but are there any things in the emergency shelter intake that are not included in here? Because I'm thinking like you could just do a continuation of what we're already gathering for that and pull over.
I think there's going to be, I don't think we're doing like the full HUD sub-assessments for income, disability, health insurance, and non-cash benefits, just to try to make it, again, more conversational and also reduce the burdens, because it looks scarier printed out than it will in HMIS, but printed out with all the sub-assessments and everything, it's going to be like 10-page form, which gets us kind of where the balance of state is, but I would say that this is more just spacing, formatting, data collection. They have a lot packed into their 10 pages. We could potentially look at adding those.
I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't add them for this purpose, because I think like, we can just collect that now.
But we could also look at for emergency shelters doing something where like either we tap our coordinated entry questions on somehow, or somehow connect things so it flows more. So as a shelter worker, you're able to do some of those steps all at once.
So that's what I'm thinking, like how can we just go ahead and knock all of that out?
We're glad to explore the pathways to make the data entry less burdensome, definitely.
On the diversion, back on that part too, I don't know, it could get too complicated, but what would you need to keep you in that place? So like for us, a common conversation would be what a protective order, or what a, like is there something system-wide that would make you feel safe to stay in your home? I don't know if that would be a good prompt there.
What I would say, just as a starting place, if we retain the other field with a text box, we could shortly after implementation collect the items that seem like they're getting more than a handful of responses, and maybe add them. we're definitely open to going ahead and adding something on the front end.
I think part of these diversion questions too is to be able to run a report that tells us that information. So then that way we can have a report that maybe runs like once a week, once every 2 weeks. And if it does indicate other, an EPO, an IPO would be necessary, then at that point we can make sure that whoever these folks are, if they're not already connected with Greenhouse 17 or involved in that process, they can be potentially for something that would be timely.
So if there's not additional revisions, discussion, we would be seeking a vote, so we would want a member to make a motion for that. Again, we are open to whatever needs to happen to make this an effective tool and process. Yeah, anyone from the membership?
Yeah.
Okay, motion from Dylan, is there a second? Alright. And all those in favor of moving forward with the approved assessment tool, Dylan's motion being that we would do the discussed changes of adjusting the one scoring issue that we had. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed? Alright, the motion passes. Thank you all for your work. I know that that's been a several months long process and it's not easy work. There's a lot of thought that went into that, so thank you.
I want to echo that thanks because I know I've taken a lot of oxygen during our coordinated entry meetings to talk about it, so I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, we will continue on, and the next thing we have on our agenda is the continuing business item. And Marissa is going to cover the housing triage system updates.
So on page 60 of your packet, you'll see the coordinated entry Q1 report. I'm going to get out of the way, and I know this television screen is small, so I apologize, but it's the same information in your packet, just maybe visually more appealing.
That's the one.
That's it. The library is a wonderful resource, and I think this HDMI input has seen a couple things and been through it because the little loosey goosey back there. There.
It's supposed to be.
There we go. I'm not very patient with technology. Okay, so the presentation is actually going to include both Q1 and Q2 for the interest of time. and because our last meeting, we did not have one. So I figured that we would do both. So that's going to be page 60 through 63 in your packet. In the first and second quarter of the calendar year, we had a total of 24 referrals. We had 0 referrals in April, and most of those referrals happening in February and May. We had 9 referrals in the second quarter, and then the rest of those referrals were in the first quarter of the year. So thinking about how that looks, this was last year's calendar, how many referrals we made, and then tacking on January, February, March, April, and May. With April, once again, being 0 referrals. We had 1 unsuccessful referral within Q1 and 4 unsuccessful referrals within Q2 of this calendar year. I will say that most of those unsuccessful referrals actually pertaining to one specific project to no fault of their own. Rather, it was merely that the referrals were made, then we were unable to find the clients, referral was made, and then determined eligibility, they weren't completely eligible for that specific project, etc. So looking at the type of projects that we are referring to, this is for both the entire first half of the year. 58.5% of those referrals were for our rapid rehousing projects, with only 1 being for transitional housing, rapid rehousing, that's 4%, and then 37.5% were for our PSH type projects. The 3 projects that received the most referrals for the first half of the calendar year were Arbor Youth, ESG, the Rapid Rehousing Project, Community Action Council's Domestic Violence Bonus Initiative in partnership with Greenhouse 17. Part of the reason that we had several referrals, especially in the beginning of the year for this project, is because that project is set to end. And because that project is set to end, we wanted to try and refer as many folks as we could at the very beginning of the year to try and set folks up for a success and to utilize that resource while it was still available and also make sure that we were still spending that money. And then lastly, New Beginnings PSH project also received several referrals. So looking at the referrals that we made during the first half of this calendar year, the majority of those were in 7. They had scored a 7 on the VSPDAT. This is something that we've seen pretty consistently, especially for our rapid rehousing projects. I also think that this slate curve is pretty representative of what we see when we just pull the entire by name list as well, with the majority of folks being in the 7 to 10 range and then trailing off in details from there. Our average score was 7.9, and you can see here the colors. Well, I'm not sure if you can because this is so small, but the colors represent which projects folks went to. So you can see like our 5, 6, 2 of those light purples were for the DBBI project. So part of the reason why we were able to refer somebody who was in that lower range, 5 or 6 and not 7, was because they had to meet the additional eligibility requirement for that project. The same is true for this like dark indigo purple color, which is Arbor Youth. Now looking at the length of time, this is from entry into the coordinated entry project to the time that they received a referral for housing. Something that I would like to see this data maybe shift when we implement our new assessment tool is actually more so looking at the time between the date that they indicate that their homelessness started and the time that it takes for them to receive a housing referral. I think that'll be a little bit more clear on the length of time that the individual had experienced homelessness before receiving the housing referral. Because as Jeff alluded to, right, this could just be somebody had a really great case manager, or we were able to speak with somebody, and we knew that they would be eligible for, DEBI, so that process happened very quickly, versus somebody who maybe their homelessness actually did start many months, a year ago. So I think that'll be a true representation of our system and how it operates. But this at the bottom is going to be the length of time, so we have 0 to 30 days. That metric is because policies and procedures, we want to address somebody's homelessness within 30 days of presentation to our system. That is where the bulk of our folks are, which is great. But then we have 31 to 99 days, 100 to 199 days, 200. We had one that was within the range of 600, and then one individual who was on coordinated entry project for over 1,000 days. These folks over here, these are unsuccessful referrals. And then the next slide are those who are added, are folks that are still pending. And this is the length of time between being added onto the coordinated entry project and enrollment into the housing project. So this means that folks were able to conduct an intake, determine eligibility, and then enroll them into that housing project. And this is based off their VSBDAT score up above as well. So you can see our individual who is over 1,000 days, they actually have full SPDAT conducted on them, which indicates high acuity. But you can also see somebody who scored a 7, which is our average. 0 to 30 days between entering into the project. For the entry project, they were enrolled into a housing project, but also some folks who scored a 7 on the VSBDAT also had to wait nearly 2 days. So moving on to folks who moved into housing. So these could be, and I think some of them are, folks who were referred within the first quarter, but some of them, and we had a couple that were referred back in November and December of last year. Again, this is looking at both first quarter and second quarter of this calendar year. But these are folks who actually moved into housing during the first half of the year. All of our referrals were housed within 300 days. Just looking at Q1, it was within 200 days of receiving the referral, with 46% of those referrals moving into housing within 30 days of referral. So the average time that it took between entry into the housing project in HMIS to actual housing move-in, the average was 71 days.
Keep in mind that generally for all program types, we're going to want to see movement to housing within 60 days, whether it's rapid or permanent supportive housing. So we're a little bit above that. We do have that landlord partnership program with LHA that just went under contract, and they're in the process of hiring staff. Hopefully that will help us to further reduce this and get to our goal.
And then lastly, this is still focusing on folks who moved into housing, and this is the average total time on the by name list for rapid rate housing folks, or folks who are referred to a rapid rate housing project. It was 186 days on the by name list, and for our permanent supportive housing folks, it was an average of 291 days on the by name list. I'm sure part of that is because we had several folks that were 600, one was 1,000, 300 days, but I think that it just speaks to, one, the fact that this is just the time that they were on the by name list, not necessarily the time that they spent experiencing homelessness, but also I think that this just speaks to how valuable of a resource it is, but how scarce of a resource that it is as well.
And why it might be served to have the flexibility if someone has a long wait time for PSH to consider with our local tiebreaker factors or continued risk of homelessness, and maybe serving them through a less intensive resource.
Exactly. And I know that we, ideally that discussion would take place during our coordinated entry case conferencing, which I think that those meetings have been very fruitful in this discussion. And I also think that in looking back, I did some basic look backs as to where we were at this time last year. And we are inching, maybe by centimeters, but we are inching closer to closing that gap. So I do think that progress is being made, but we know that it's a lengthy wait time, and we know that it's not the quickest of processes. So really having the ability to have dynamic prioritization and having those divergent questions, especially for some of our folks that maybe score within that 5-6 range, I think that would be really, really helpful to address these folks here and potentially, and especially because that's where our bell curve is on the entire binding list. How can we move you into housing quicker that is going to be sustainable? Because while this is a really great resource, it's not the most timely, and we could end your literal homelessness sooner.
And we are working on a couple of strategies that we'll be able to share more with you on in the near future that will help us run alongside what we're doing in coordinated entry and further reduce that amount of time.
So I just touched on the high points of those two reports that are in front of you because I knew that we would talk a lot about the assessment tool, but I'm happy to answer any questions or concerns.
HUD definition confusion, so I'm asking this question, sorry. But if in the diversion, you're starting to kind of more, like how can we help people with some of the diversion options? Is that going to hinder them if the long-term goal is to do permanent supportive housing, or because now you kind of stopgap their homelessness? Like is that gonna impact them down the road if they're like, I don't wanna take this diversion because I really need permanent supportive housing?
So essentially what we're going to try to shift our system towards is to incorporate a higher level of what HUD referred to as housing problem solving, which is going to be so much of diversion, rapid exit, rapid resolution. And so we'll envision this as kind of a strategy where as you start this conversation of this assessment, you work continuously from that point all the way to the end that someone gets a coordinated entry or a housing triage referral, running a problem solving conversation. Those diversion questions are kind of an example of that. We're hoping to introduce some resources that would be lower level interventions that are a little bit more flexible, that we can potentially solve it with just case management, potentially solve it with case management and or financial assistance, and then ultimately someone may remain on the list to continue all the way until they get that permanent supportive housing referral. But we want to keep that other conversation running simultaneously and system-wide the entire time, so that at any point there's an opportunity that meets the true need, and we feel like it's adequate, but it's quicker, and it makes the individual experience less trauma and briefer time. We want to pursue it, but essentially we don't want the diversion to foreclose somebody being able to get to an ultimate referral if that's what they need, but just that we continue that conversation, and if there is a point where a less intensive intervention is right, that we can help them to pursue it. And the other thing is just client choice. And it should be someone's choice whether their pathway to housing, if they feel like they really truly need that level and they want to remain on the list and not take other offers, then they can remain on the list. We need to make sure that people have choice between the level and type of resource that they are referred to. And while we might, in some scenarios, feel like they should take one or the other, it is really important that we underscore the value of someone's choice and self-determination. So does that help?
It does 100% help, and I love that. I think there's lots of things in diversion or problem solving. I think it can kind of come along. I just sort of always have this looming thing about like when the person's applying for disability. Like I have a lot of folks who are applying for disability, but they're afraid to even take a little part-time job, knowing that disability is not going to come for a year or two and they're so afraid of doing some problem-solving pieces because they don't want to jeopardize the case.
The
And
other
I just
scenario
want
that
to
it
create
really kind of
this.
pose a problem is that we finally had a referral for that person, they were no longer in a homeless situation under the HUD definition. that would be an issue. But if they've taken one of those less intensive interventions and failed and returned to homelessness, then we have the flexibility of calculating chronic homelessness cumulatively rather than consecutively. So as long as they can still have 12 plus months in the 3-year period that we're looking at, they could still try, and if they returned and really needed, demonstrated they had to have that resource, they would still be eligible if they were homeless at time of referral.
And this is not in the divergent questions, but one of the questions that we do ask in our post-assessment is, and it's open-ended, is what is the one thing that you think would help you achieve your housing goals? Because we really want input from folks, maybe there is a potential problem-solving solution that we're not thinking of. And so asking folks, yourself, like, what would be a resource that you think would help assist, will allow us to better assist in that.
Got an addressing engagement too, they did take a lower intervention and that didn't work out.
It would depend on exactly what kind of a situation that we're talking about. Like, if someone moved into permanent housing, we can't, per our policies, we can't go ahead and directly then place them into rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing. But if they return to homelessness from that situation, we can go back onto the list and be referred out. And we could consider tiebreaker factors to where if they were on the list with equal prioritization of someone else, we could consider more quickly potentially connecting that individual because we see their continuing risk to remain in that situation without the referral. So there's a little bit of flexibility. We're never going to get around HUD's definition entirely unless we were to radically transform this situation and have a high level of non-HUD resources that we can pull into our system.
I know to turn it off in case I can't turn it back on. Are there any questions? No?
Great, thanks so much, Marissa. And Marissa, you are also going to be covering the HMIS training and announcements.
Yeah, so the next HMIS training is going to be tomorrow at 9 a.m. and thereafter is going to be September 12th. Those are going to be the next 2 HMIS trainings. If you need any folks who need training, please get with me and let me know. As for other announcements, the next end user group will actually, as of this time, will not be taking place in September. That is for capacity reasons, as we will be entrenched in the COC NOFO competition. However, we do plan to have a HMIS end user work group that's happening in November.
So that November session, we will focus on some of the upcoming data submissions and some things that end users and those entering data are going to impact. But as Marcia said, for capacity, our office is still in the process of hiring an HMIS data analyst, and we know that both our office and a lot of our community partners are going to be in the midst of making their COC applications. So we just wanted to make sure that we didn't overextend either ourselves or you all.
Thank you.
All right, so the next item is really covering other issues and public sharing. Does anyone have anything to cover?
Question about NOFO. Do you all have an estimated time that of when we'll submit our cooperative application?
So the collaborative application is going to be due on October 30th. And so what we do anticipate is we are working to update all of our competition documents to reflect this year's NOFO. And we would hope to release that next week so that we can try to either piggyback off of the Program Performance and Evaluation Committee, or if we can't obtain a quorum, then we could potentially schedule a special meeting for that same week at the time that works best for our board. And we're gonna go ahead and send them a communication about that before the end of this week so that we can align and determine when we send out an announcement, if it's gonna be like at the front of program performance, then that will appear on the agenda packet that's sent out. But we hope by next Wednesday to release the materials for the competition and get approval on the week of that program performance and evaluation committee meeting, which I believe is the 21st. We're probably going to be looking at something like about a 4-week window for the local competition to be open and for providers to work on their applications. And then that will give us time to do some of the back-end steps that we need to in order to score and rank with our committee, notify providers of their awards, and finish up the collaborative application, especially if there's anything in our project listing that we feel like needs to be explicitly tied to the content of our collaborative application. We, unfortunately, since we have no board meeting in October, we'll definitely be scheduling a special meeting with our board. We'll be flexible in making that a Zoom meeting, or Teams meeting rather, and at a convenient time for everybody. But we will have to present that project listing and the draft of the collaborative application so that we can post in advance. It works out really awkwardly. We have to notify our partners of their awards no later than 15 days before the end of the competition. We have a meeting that's scheduled for October 16th, which would just be like, is HUD counting that last day in the 15 days? So to be on the safe side, we're gonna bump it up and not lose points by potentially being 1 day off and notifying everyone. Does that help give you a sense of where we're going?
Not like 2 weeks from now.
But you'll be looking at like a late September deadline for the local competition of applications. And on that note, Marissa sent out communication today. We are offering some office hours before we officially open the competition. If any of our renewal applicants or even someone who's thinking about applying wants to get some individualized attention with us, we can speak more freely before the competition is open. Once the local competition begins, we can help with technical aspects of your application, but can't really guide you to what things would be a more favorable program design that might impact your school.
Mercer, I had that link and it said.
Yes, you're not the only one. It was set to expire for one person signed up, and that lucky person was Jackie. So everyone else is not out of luck. Resend it with that link once more that's open.
Look, she's hot on stuff.
Right.
Sender's like, oh.
Any other public comments? Alrighty, I'll take the silence as a no. So our next meeting will be October 2nd, 2024 at 1:30. Same place here, so the East Side Branch, Lexington Public Library.
And I will say I made an effort to confirm our dates for the rest of the year after the June snafu. They did say that yes, they have record of those. However, in that discussion about the missed meeting, it was told to me that essentially when we schedule in advance that they can cancel on us at any time. They only guarantee within something like a 30-day window, which was never part of the conversation in scheduling this year's meetings or in any of the previous years, and we've used several different libraries over several different years. So if there is a change, we might be in the same situation again. So for next year, we might look at some non-library locations. You may want to let me know if you have a great meeting space for us.
All right, well with that, we will adjourn. Thank you.